Joining us now from London is Andrea Matolcsi. She's the Program Officer for Sexual Violence and Trafficking with Equality Now, a non-profit devoted to protecting the human rights of women and girls around the world. And with us from New York is the Executive Director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, Taina Bien-Aime. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Taina, let me start with you. As we saw there, it's heart-wrenching to see that children in all their innocence being trafficked, being sold, in some instances, by their parents. And here we have a television crew which found the perpetrators, the culprits, sitting very nonchalantly in a shed there while this crew came towards them. How do they get away with this?
They get away with it because of a number of reasons, including corruption on the part of government. And, you know, from the clip, it sounds like the clip is focusing on the children being exploited and on the traffickers, but there's the missing link, and that is the demand, because someone is purchasing these children. And we know that plane loads of men from Western Europe and the United States come every day to Cambodia and Vietnam and other parts of the world to purchase these children. And those are the ones we need to focus on. It's really targeting the demand and ending the buying of sex for children and women and men.
Right. I want to get to that side of this issue, this crisis in a moment, the demand side of things, and who are the people purchasing these young children. Andrea, if I could ask you, how prevalent is this problem in developed countries in Europe?
It's very common. This is something that happens in every single country across the world, no matter what the economic status of that country is. It's an issue that's founded on inequalities. You will always have within each society people who are worse off, who have less opportunities in life, who are more vulnerable to this type of exploitation. So this is something that's very prevalent in Western Europe, and it does have to be tied back to the demand issue, because in Western Europe and in developed countries, there is a huge demand, because there is also a lot of men mainly who are willing to pay for sex from victims of exploitation, whether those are children or adults. And so that is why this is also such a huge issue in these countries, because there is a reason that traffickers are bringing women and girls and boys and men to the Western European and to other developed countries, is because there is a price and there is a profit to be made in these countries.
Taina, take us through what happens. I mean, there we saw those pictures of a village in Cambodia. That's a village near the capital, Phnom Penh. And in some instances, as I mentioned, you know, these kids are sold by their parents, they're trafficked by others, criminals who operate in these areas. What happens to these kids? What is the process that they go through? What happens to them?
Well, as you can imagine, these children are being brutally raped, suffering torture, are broken. Many of these children do not survive. And even those who survive, when they turn 18, they don't miraculously turn into quote-unquote consensual, and again, I quote, this is not a term I use, but consensual sex workers. So we as an international community have the legal frameworks to address this. We have international legal instruments that governments have abided to. There are many national laws that target trafficking, and in many countries targeting exploitation in the sex trade, including prostitution. But what we don't have is the political will of governments to really target the traffickers, target the buyers of sex, and really protect these children. And as Andrea said, this is also an issue of inequality. The majority of people who are trafficked in the sex trade are women and children, and women and girls in particular. So human beings that are not considered as full human beings, the second-class citizens that are fungible in a market of exploitation and misery.
Andrea, as Taina pointed out, you know, you may have these laws, but there is no political will. I mean, across the world, do we see something like a database that is being set up for pedophiles? I mean, governments, law enforcement officers must know who these people are. They travel around the world. They get onto planes. They go to places like Cambodia, buy children to exploit them. Is there a database of all these pedophiles? We have databases on terrorists. We have no-fly lists with 1 million people on it. Why not a database for pedophiles?
Yeah, it does depend on the region or the country. Some countries do have, obviously, sex offender registries, sex offender lists, where if you've been convicted of a sexual offense, especially a sexual offense against a child, then you're on that list, and that is on your record for life. And then in some countries where they actually do have more initiatives in this issue, in this area, they will then make sure that people who are on these lists are barred, for example, from traveling to certain countries, or at a minimum have to report to the government that they are traveling to those countries. But that's the minimum. There are regional databases, and there are ways to have this data collected and used. But again, this is something that I think is in the beginning steps, and it's kind of in the beginning of development. But there are efforts towards this to better keep track of perpetrators and to make sure that they don't go on to abuse again.
Andrea, to what extent is this trafficking, this trade in children being driven by poverty in developing countries? I mean, we know that to a large extent it's being driven by demand, by pedophiles, but to what extent is it being driven by poverty?
Sure. Well, poverty is absolutely one of the push factors. It's something that makes someone more vulnerable to exploitation, and that includes to sexual exploitation and trafficking, and to being in prostitution as a child. And as an adult. This is one factor. However, in the end, it is they are exploited in prostitution, and they are sex trafficked because there's a market for it, because there's the demand. So many people experience poverty, but it depends what networks you're exposed to, what your other circumstances are, and if there is someone there who thinks they can make money off of you in prostitution, that determines how you will be exploited and if you will be exploited. So poverty is one factor among many, but it's a push factor, and ultimately it comes down to demand. But we also have to recognize that in addition to poverty, there's many other factors that make a person vulnerable, and that includes their ethnicity, if they belong to a any way marginalized community, gender obviously being the main factor. You're more likely to be sex trafficked if you're female. If you're disabled, you're more likely as well. So there are all these kinds of factors that exacerbate someone's vulnerability, but ultimately it's the demand that results in them being trafficked.
Right, Taina, the reports that tell us that these young children and others who are trafficked are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to the traffickers. And you mentioned earlier on, you know, they don't miraculously sort of come out of these situations when they turn 16 and start to lead a normal life. Of course, they're damaged for a long, long time. They need treatment. They need psychological counseling and things like that. I mean, do they get that? Are those kind of facilities available?
Well, unfortunately, the governments have relied on local grassroots and direct service provider organizations to provide these type of services. And as we know, the non-governmental organization community is highly under-resourced, constantly under attack, and can only address the suffering and the services needed for a handful of victims. So we do need to have a global component of investing resources into this issue. And we're seeing a few, I mean, we've been working on this for over 20 years, so we're seeing some progress, but clearly not enough. And to go back to the issue of poverty, both boys and girls are poor, but somehow the overwhelming majority of people in prostitution are being exploited in the sex trade are, as Andrea said, female. And so we also have to make links with violence against women, because in many of these societies where there is a high rate of exploitation among girl children, also happen to be societies where girls are thrown away, denied access to education, married at a young age, subjected to female genital mutilation, etc. So we do have to go back to our acceptance or our lack of political will in ending violence against women and ending discrimination based on gender inequality.
Right, Andrea, when you look at the pedophiles who exploit these kids, I mean, they come from all kinds, you know, all over the place. I mean, some of them are very wealthy people, some of them are professionals, some of them are married, they have children of their own, etc. And to what extent, I'm wondering, are they being protected? You know, because as Taina said earlier on, there just isn't the political will to tackle this problem, to tackle this crisis.
Yes, and part of that has to do with the general culture around violence against women and girls and around sexual exploitation. We know that there's a culture of silence. There is a culture that prevents victims from speaking out because they feel that they will be blamed if they come out and say that they have been abused. Some victims experience this from a very young age, so it's something that's relatively quote-unquote normal for them. This is how they've related to their body from a young age, let's say, so it's harder to kind of recognize boundaries. The adults who are perpetrating this kind of abuse are very aware of this. They know that there is kind of a tacit acceptance of abuse and sexual abuse and exploitation. And if you look at the wider picture, we know that generally across cultures, and less so in some cultures now, but generally there is an acceptance of prostitution as such and of the purchase of women and girls and men and boys for sexual access. So as long as that culture is in place, and that's okay, it's hard for potential perpetrators who want to abuse children to suddenly think that, well, this is wrong, because it's something that's more accepted across the board anyway.
Andrea, Taina, thanks to both of you for joining us.